Hey, everybody, and welcome to Beyond the Breakers, a podcast about shipwrecks, loss, and lessons learned from maritime disasters. My name is Taylor, and I'll be joined shortly here by my co-host Tanner. But first, the most important thing, let's shout out a new patron. Thank you to Pyro Kitty Studios for supporting us on Patreon. Hope you enjoy the bonus content. We actually just got done recording a bonus episode, the real July bonus episode, and it's really good. So, yeah, if you're feeling generous, sign up for the Patreon, check that content out. It's a fun time. With that out of the way, I will bring in Tanner. Tanner, how you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. I'm a little sleepy.
Yeah, I know there was if you follow us on Twitter, you guys probably saw there was a little cat drama last night.
Yeah, we had a surprise visit to the vet, to the emergency vet for Josephine, but she's totally fine now, back to her normal self.
Awesome. There's really no better outcome than that when you go to the emergency vet.
Yeah, we've got like a fair amount of experience taking cats to the emergency vet, and it tends to be a coin flip as to how those things usually end. And this one ended very well. Everybody's
nice,
happy and healthy and eating and doing all their normal stuff.
That is a good thing. Did you have any time for any media with all that going
on? A little bit. I mean, this week leading up to this, I had been reading the book Captive Paradise about the history of Hawaii by, I think, James Haley is the author's name. I wasn't super impressed with the writing. I kind of got what I wanted out of the book, but only like the first 80-ish pages cover Hawaii like before it's basically taken over by missionaries. And
yeah, that's not the part I'm interested in.
I kind of wanted a little bit more about that. Like, I'm sure you can write more about that.
Mm-hmm.
So I ditched that one. Another skill as you grow up, you learn like when to just ditch a book that you're reading, because there's a million times more books out there than you could possibly read. Don't waste your time reading one that's not doing anything for you.
Mm-hmm.
So I ditched that one, and I finally started into the book Yesterday's Deterrent by Jonathan Steinberg, the same guy who wrote that Bismarck biography that I read recently.
Mm-hmm.
This is one of his first publications. Copy I have is from 1965. And it's a book about Alfred von Tirpitz and the development of the German Navy in the lead up to World War I. Nice. So a topic we've discussed a lot, but that's supposed to be a very good study on, and kind of one of the first comprehensive studies on Tirpitz and his role in building the German Navy that we talk about so often on this show.
Mm-hmm.
Aside from that, as we were at the vet last night, I think we were there for 6 or 7 hours total. Most of that just waiting. We kept up with the Brewers, and Brewers are staying in it. They're a game and a half up on the Reds. And last night, Sal Frelick, who had just been called up, they sent Raimel Tapia down, and they brought up Sal Frelick in the outfield. He had probably the most insane big league debut that I've ever seen.
Mm-hmm.
He went 3 for 3 with a sacrifice fly, 2 RBIs, including the game winner in the 8th inning, and he made 2 awesome plays in the outfield to beat the Braves, who are like, I think they have like the best record in baseball.
Yeah, I saw those highlights actually when we were taking a break between our recordings here.
Just making it look easy out there.
He really did.
Pretty much all you could ask for from an MLB debut. So very exciting. Going to add some much needed energy to the Brewers to get them through the final stretch of the season here. So I'm excited about that.
Yeah, it's always fun. I'm honestly just glad that the Brewers and the Reds are competitive.
It is fun. It makes that division a lot more fun when it's the Brewers and Reds at the top rather than like the Cubs and the Cardinals, as it so often has been.
Yeah, it really does make a difference. And it's getting me closer and closer to football season.
Yeah, every day that gets closer, I'm so excited.
Yeah, I'm finally starting to get kind of the urges again for that.
What else have you been up to?
Oh, what have I been up to? Women's World Cup has been fun. I've been watching that. It's one of the joys of working a weird work schedule is that like 2 a.m. soccer is a good thing. Mm-hmm. It's fun watching the U.S. get their first win. I feel like it should have been by more, but that's also being greedy. I feel like I'm the like evil parent in a children's movie that yells at their kid after they win a game. Mm-hmm. But, good to beat Vietnam in something.
Doesn't happen a lot.
What else? There was a couple scores that I found interesting. I think England only beat Haiti 1-0. I feel like you want more than that if you're England.
Not a great start there.
Like a draw is a loss in that regard. Mm-hmm. And France is tied Jamaica.
Jamaica always has strong teams. I mean, their men's team is always, a thorn in the side of the other CONCACAF powers. But yeah, there's some fun stuff going on with the Women's World Cup.
Yeah, for sure. And then just continuing to get through Max Hastings, The Secret War, Spies, Codes, and Guerrillas, 1939 to 45. And it's actually really good. They spend a lot of time. He purposely spends more time with the Japanese and the Russians and stuff, and kind of just talking about what their code breaking operations looked like. And
the leftist, anti-imperialist Japanese.
Yes, them that we were just talking about. But he also spends time with the British and the Americans, but even France and Poland and their contributions to this stuff. So there's a lot of really cool stories. It's not the spy stories from World War II. It's very much just the nuts and bolts of how all this stuff functioned and worked. And it's just fun that he just talks about how often blind luck and stupid people play a role in these things. It's not James Bond.
Right.
Yeah, it's a good book. I like all of his work. I know plenty of people have critiques and criticisms of it, but I think as far as being accessible history that I want to read, I think he does it as well as anybody. Read his Vietnam book. His Vietnam book is really good.
That's one that I've thought about before and almost ordered several times, I think.
Yeah, it's very good. Anyways, other things that are good. Let's talk about the CSS Alabama.
The Confederacy.
Yeah, not good. No, actually, yeah, this is not good. But
not a good start to the episode.
No. But it's a good story, I guess we'll say, and it's going to be our topic today. So, the CSS Alabama was a screw sloop of war launched in July of 1862. So she is our favorite type of vessel. She has a propeller and she has sails. That's always fun. We like that.
I thought you meant a sloop of war, and I was like, when did we decide that?
No, I would pick a better warship than a sloop of war.
Pick a better warship than a Confederate warship.
Yeah, that's true, too. Well, one that doesn't sink at the end. So she is built by John Laird's Sons and Company in Birkenhead, England, which is near Liverpool, but Birkenhead should stand out as a name that we've talked about. She would originally only be referred to by her shipyard number of 0290 before being launched as the Enrica. She was 220 feet long, 32-foot beam, and an 18-foot draft. So, pretty compact. She had 6 32-pound cannons, one 110-pound cannon, and one 68-pound cannon. Additionally, she would have a 2-cylinder, 300-horsepower horizontal steam engine, along with her sails. So, like we said, she can do both. Get you a ship that can do both.
I imagine, and this is kind of similar, we've talked about passenger steamers with the horizontal style engine and what that did for your space options. You didn't have this huge column running up through the middle of your ship. So I imagine for a warship like this, something that needs gun decks, that's probably really helpful.
Yeah, and more room for, powder and magazines and stuff like that. You want to have space where you can have that stuff. So yeah, that would definitely be nice.
You could have a Jason Aldean concert in there.
You could. They would have loved it. They would have loved Jason Aldean. One interesting note about this vessel is that her funnel was retractable.
What?
This could be done to disguise the fact that she was a steamer and just to overall obscure her identity.
That is something straight from Wild Wild West, the movie.
Well, especially at this time, because I know during World War I and World War II, a lot of commerce raiders had that as an option. Mm-hmm. But yeah, that is very much Wild Wild West.
That's really cool.
It's the coolest thing about this ship. So at this point, you might be wondering why it's called the CSS Alabama. For those of you who aren't steeped in American Civil War history, I guess, that would be the Confederate States of America. And you might be wondering, why was the Confederate States of America, why was one of their naval vessels being built in England in 1862 while the Civil War is going on? That would be as a result of the work from the Confederate agent, Commander James Bullock. He would manage to finance and figure this out while the war is going on. And he would do this by working through the Fraser Trenholm Company, which was a cotton broker in Liverpool, sympathetic to the Confederate cause.
That's interesting, and maybe you'll get into this also, but it came up in, I think when we talked about the Union blockade and some of the inventiveness that the Confederates had to get up to with currency, because, it's towards the end of the war, and basically Confederate currency being worthless, and cotton basically becoming just the thing you buy and sell stuff with.
Yeah. So it's important to note at this time that Britain is neutral in the conflict, and that did not allow for the construction of armored ships. However, there was no rule saying you couldn't construct a ship that could be armed, in theory, especially once that ship had reached international waters.
That's so funny, these technicalities in the rules.
This is very reminiscent of Germany building up its fleet, like after World War I, which is weird because we just talked about that in our bonus episode.
Not the only parallel that we'll see in this episode between the CSA
right.
and Nazi Germany.
This meant that the Alabama was constructed with a reinforced deck, gun mounts, and powder magazines, but no actual guns. So they're literally just building a bare ship for them, like a blank canvas to be armed.
Amazing.
On July 29th, 1862, while still known as the Enrica, the vessel would slip out of Birkenhead. Captain Bullock had arranged for the vessel to be manned by a civilian crew, and it made its way to Terceira Island in the Azores.
We know Terceira. Listen to the Spanish Armada episodes. You might recognize Terceira as the island that Dom Antonio fled to kind of set up a Portuguese government in exile. I think we refer to it as like Portugal's Taiwan for a little bit there in the 1580s.
Yeah, it is interesting like how many places come up again and again in the stuff that we do. So as a result of this, the USS Tuscarora, which is in Southampton, is dispatched to intercept the vessel. So obviously there's people, there's intelligence assets in the harbor being like, hey, this vessel's pretty suspicious and it's on the move. Like it was an open secret. The United States knows what's actually going on here. So Bullock would then depart Liverpool on the steamer Bahama, along with the Alabama's new captain, Raphael Sims, on August 13th, 1862. So you can see this timeline. Like this is taking place over the course of many weeks, this whole process. And it's interesting that, this definitely not armed vessel being manned by a definitely not Confederately affiliated crew. Like, it's interesting.
It reminds me of the, I don't know the details of the story, but I remember it from the Guns of August, where there's this, I think they're two Turkish cruisers or battleships.
Mm-hmm.
And like, they're totally just crewed and commanded by Germans.
Yeah, I do remember that story.
Who like kind of have to keep up an appearance that this is an Ottoman ship, but it's definitely not.
Sims would arrive on August 20th to oversee the refitting of the vessel. The process would take 3 days, and the vessel was outfitted with guns, ammunition, and supplies. Note that these guns were also constructed in Britain.
But as long as they're not put together in Britain.
Yeah, this is 100% the made in the USA thing where all the parts are made in China, but it's just put together in the US. That's what they're doing here. They're making a definitely not made in Britain vessel. On August 24th, the Enrica was officially commissioned into the Confederate Navy. Her name was then changed to the CSS Alabama. Men were transferred from the Bahama and the supply ship Agrippina to the Alabama. So there's 2 ships there at this point. There's the Bahama and the Agrippina, who has brought additional supplies. In total, 24 officers were transferred once everything was done. The problem is, that's all the men that he had, and that's not enough to run this vessel.
He has 24 men and all of them are officers?
Yeah, they were the ones that knew they were going to do this.
Okay.
He just figured he could find a crew. Captain Sims would then read the commission from President Jefferson Davis. This was followed by a rendition of Dixie and the lowering of the British colors to make way for the Confederates. Captain Sims then made a speech imploring the crew of the other vessels to join the Confederate cause. This did not get the intended response, and Sims followed that up with a signing bonus, double wages, and pay in gold.
All right.
This was apparently enough to convince 83 men, many of whom were actually British citizens, to sign a contract for Confederate naval service. Sims knew that he'd still need another 20 men or so to adequately staff the vessel, but he figured he could get those from captured vessels or recruiting from friendly ports. But he had enough to run the ship now, at least.
I feel like this is kind of a microcosm of the Confederate strategy as a whole of like, you know what? Let's just do this. Let's roll the dice and we'll figure out the details later of how this is actually going to work long term.
Also, I like the idea of like he could get people from like captured vessels because like that would be how you'd get me to work for you. But like, if I'm in a lifeboat and you just sank my ship, like, sure. Yeah, you got food, you got water. I'm down. At least till I find a convenient place to like ditch. Like, you got me. So with his work complete, Bullock would return to Liverpool and continue other pursuits for the Confederate Navy. That dude probably has the best job in all of the Confederacy, because like, if the South loses, you're like, I'm just going to stay over here, actually.
Decades later, you just discover a man who speaks suspiciously Savannah accented French.
A whole line of Bullocks in France.
Bullock. It's spelled with like a Q-U-E.
Family history starts in like 1866. There's just not much before then.
Yeah.
All right, so moving on to the activities of the Alabama. She would spend her first 2 months patrolling the eastern Atlantic. She would sail southwest of the Azores before doubling back to the east, all the while sinking and looting American vessels that she encountered.
This is such a crazy part of the Civil War because it's not like covered at all.
Yeah.
Unless you go out of your way to read about the Civil War, I would say that like most people aren't aware that there's Confederate ships preying on Union shipping in the Atlantic, like in the exact same way that the Germans were doing during the World Wars.
And it gets like crazier than that. Some of the places we'll end up going, like it truly is a little mind blowing that like this much is happening. So after this, she would make her way to the coast of New England before sailing south and arriving in the West Indies. She'd ultimately find her way into the Gulf of Mexico. While in the Gulf, the Alabama was involved in her first actual engagement with an American Navy vessel. Prior to that, she's just picking on unarmed vessels, basically, as a merchant raider does.
Right. It's kind of the job.
Yeah, it's not supposed to be fair fights. You'll see what happens when she finally fights a fair fight. So she happened upon the Union sidewhaler USS Hatteras near Galveston, Texas. Which
we're back.
We just cannot escape Galveston. It keeps coming up. So Hatteras was part of the Union blockade that we've previously discussed in other episodes. A very effective strategy overall, but, there's always going to be little victories for the other side. We're about to talk about one of those.
Also, I will say there is that full bonus episode that we did. I think it's called Scott's Pretty Good Snake. And we talked in detail about the Union blockade and kind of the historical assessment of its effectiveness. Like there's different takes on, was this war-winning strategy, or was this more of just like a mild annoyance? So yeah, we talk about that a lot.
So on the afternoon of January 11th, 1863, Hatteras would sight a sail just over the horizon and would give chase, departing around 3 p.m. Hatteras would follow Alabama for the next 4 hours, not knowing her identity. Finally, once in hailing distance, the Hatteras demanded to know the vessel's identification. Alabama replied, "Her Majesty's ship Petrel."
Her mainmast grows a couple of feet as she's telling this lie.
So not satisfied with this, the Hatteras launched a longboat to inspect this British vessel. As the longboat was launched, the unknown vessel displayed a new signal. "We are the CSS Alabama." The Union Jack was lowered and the Confederate battle flag raised. That had to be a bad feeling if you're in that longboat.
But I can just imagine like the captain of the Hatteras being like, seeing this, well, we're the British ship Petrel, and him being like, "No, you are not. No, you are not."
Yeah, I do picture them being like, "No, you're not."
I imagine like him being like, that's not what that is. Go check it out. And then like as they get close and they raise like the real flag and they say, "Haha, we're the Alabama. We tricked you." He's like, no, you didn't. You did not at all. It didn't work.
So upon raising the Confederate flag, the Alabama immediately fires on the Hatteras, which prompted a nearly 20-minute exchange of fire. The main body of the Union fleet became aware of this, and they were actually able to see and hear the fighting nearly 16 miles away. In response to this, the cruiser Brooklyn was dispatched to investigate and render assistance if needed. However, this came too late, as the Hatteras had already been severely damaged and had holes in her hull in 2 different places. The captain of Hatteras ordered the magazines flooded to prevent fire, and then fired a single bow gun showing that they surrendered and required assistance. To the credit of the Alabama, lifeboats were immediately launched and men pulled from the water. Of the 126 men on the Hatteras, 2 were killed, 5 were wounded, and 6, including her captain, were able to escape capture. Alabama only would suffer 2 wounded during this fight. And upon arriving on the scene early the next morning, Brooklyn found the hulk of Hatteras about 20 miles south of Galveston. Only her mast stuck out of the water, with her commissioning pennant still flapping in the breeze. It's important to note in this, and I thought I'd put it in the notes, but I must not have. The Hatteras is an old vessel. Mm-hmm. I think she was built maybe in the 1820s.
So like a really old vessel.
Yeah, like this is not a mod. Like there's a reason she's just part of a blockade fleet. Like she's just there to occupy space. Mm-hmm. They definitely got lucky that they kind of found her off by herself.
She's like the cornerback who has pulled a hamstring, and like the quarterback is able to diagnose it like, hey, this dude can't cover right now. So like this is going to be the target.
And Brooklyn is that free safety that's reading the play just a little too late.
Mm-hmm. Also, I think it's interesting here just to, you mentioned like to the credit of the Alabama, lifeboats are put in the water, and not just in the Civil War, but you see that when we've talked about naval warfare in, both world wars, and how you do tend to have that sense of fair play in these naval engagements more so than you might otherwise. And plus, this is relatively early in the war, kind of the middle of the war. And just given the nature of the Civil War, like realistically, a lot of these people wouldn't have been seeing the other side as their mortal enemy that they needed to destroy under any circumstances.
Well, especially with so much of this crew being British.
Right. So it's like there is more of a sense of camaraderie across the aisle, if you will. But yeah, I think regardless of situation, with some exceptions that we've talked about, but you even see this from, German U-boats.
To the best of abilities sometimes, which, like we've said before, how the U-boat kind of changes how this functions. Because you're just not able to do this.
Even though I did just torpedo you and put you in the water, rendering aid as much as possible to those people in the water.
So after this action, Alabama would continue south and operate off of the coast of Brazil. Hey. And she would actually have some of her most productive days there. She would capture the bark Conrad and commission her as the CSS Tuscaloosa. She would be kind of used as like a supply ship, essentially. They would actually partner quite a bit in the future. In total, she would capture or burn 29 vessels off the coast of Brazil. So very productive. I honestly didn't realize how much United States shipping was going on at this time, like in these places. That's a lot of vessels.
Yeah, and like I knew with the Alabama specifically, and you'll talk about her other raids also, but like she and other Confederate vessels just like tore up U.S. whaling ships in the Pacific and elsewhere, which again is a very underreported, I think, part of the war. But like, it's an interesting example of commerce raiding, a navy that can't challenge the other navy toe to toe, but the world's a very big place. And if you put 2 or 3 vessels out, in the vast open ocean, you can have a field day on these ships that are by and large unprotected until you meet one that does have guns.
So she would then sail east across the Atlantic and sail down the southwestern coast of Africa, still picking off Union vessels that she encountered along the way. She would then stop for provisions in Cape Town, South Africa.
Oh, no.
And apparently...
That's not where you want Confederates to be.
Apparently left a lasting impression.
Yeah, I'd say so.
Maybe, would you like to read the name of the song, this South African folk song that was created to commemorate her visit?
Looks like it's called Da Kom die Alabama, which I assume is like Here Comes the Alabama.
Yeah, probably. I have in the notes here highlighted Confederate and South African synergy, not good.
Good networking opportunity for them. They could get into some good breakout sessions, really start sharing some ideas back and forth there.
There's this weird guy that owned an emerald mine, and he just kept trying to like sell me stuff.
He said he was going to build a rocket. I don't even know what a rocket is.
So while operating in the Indian Ocean, she was able to take 3 prizes and avoid the Union vessel USS Wyoming that was dispatched to hunt for her.
We also just talked about another USS Wyoming in our bonus episode.
That is weird. There's a lot of synergies going on here. All unintentional, too.
I mean, I assume it's a different USS Wyoming.
I would think. The next one, probably. So she then made her way to the East Indies, where she continued to raid. She would transit the Cape of Good Hope and make her way to France for a rest and refit. So throughout her journey, she had been hunted by Union vessels, but rarely seen. In total, she would burn 65 Union ships, mostly of the merchant variety. In general, though, it is noted that care was taken to not harm passengers or crew, only to detain them until they could be released to a neutral port or ship. So it is noted, like like we were saying, like there's almost like a chivalric code or something here. Like their goal is to disrupt shipping, not kill people. Right. They want to be an economic impact. That's their goal. And I think it's probably smart because it's sort of almost the Robin Hood thing in a way. Like, it's not personal. You're just doing your job.
Again, this is one of those kind of interesting cat and mouse stories, except you've got like hundreds of cats and one mouse. Mm-hmm. But the house that they're hunting in is the entire ocean, basically. Mm-hmm. And how challenged, it doesn't matter how many ships you've got, like communication over long distances is much harder at this point. So, if this vessel is seen off the coast of South Africa and you get the news about it 2 weeks later, she could be anywhere.
Yeah.
I mean, it would be an interesting, I'm sure there's a movie like this or a book like this, but it would make an interesting story like that.
Absolutely. That actually would be a very interesting story.
But unfortunately, it's impossible to make a movie about something without glorifying it. So no one should ever make a movie about the CSS Alabama.
That's what I learned from the Oppenheimer takes. So in total, her raids can be broken down as follows. The Eastern Atlantic from August to September of 1862, New England from October to November of 1862, the Gulf of Mexico, December 1862 to January 1863, the South Atlantic from February to July of 1863, South Africa, August to September 1863, Indian Ocean, September to November of 1863, and the South Pacific in December of 1863.
This is like one of those bands on tour t-shirts.
God, if it wasn't Confederate, it would be so cool to make that.
Well, I mean, you could make like a Pantera shirt for it.
That's true. In total, the Alabama would spend 534 days of her 657 days of existence at sea. That's pretty crazy.
Not a lot of time on the bench.
She would never visit a Confederate port, and she would board around 450 vessels.
Wow.
She would burn 65 vessels and take over 2,000 sailors prisoner. So that's pretty substantial. I do find it funny that she never visited a port that was like owned by the Confederacy.
Yeah, that is really interesting because it's like kind of Confederate in name only.
A Kino.
Her officers are, but like her crew, like you said, is largely not. They may have sympathies with the Confederacy, but that's not where they're from.
The final kind of synopsis of her life, it's claimed that no lives were lost amongst the prisoners that she took, and that her crew suffered no losses as well. I don't know if I believe that. I don't think I believe that.
But, as you pointed out, like she is very rarely actually getting into combat.
I just feel like, though, being at sea that long, it's just dangerous enough.
I would maybe believe that her crew suffered no losses to combat death.
Yeah.
I would assume that like sometime over, crossing, circumnavigating the world, whatever, just being at sea with all of the dangers that entails, disease, just natural stuff that happens. I would believe that statistic much more easily if it was like there was no combat deaths.
Yeah, me too. So all this background brings us to June 11th, 1864. The place, Cherbourg, France.
Yeah.
The Alabama has just arrived. Captain Sims requested permission to dry dock and repair his ship. In pursuit of the Alabama, the USS Kearsarge, under the command of Captain John Ancrum Winslow, arrives off the coast of Cherbourg 3 days later. He's a man on a mission. Winslow's been pursuing the Alabama, and while previously in Gibraltar, had requested the assistance of the sloop of war USS St. Louis. Launched in 1828, the St. Louis was ancient by, standards of an ocean-going warship, but she could still occupy space and assist. More importantly, it meant that the Alabama was now trapped in the harbor and outnumbered. Knowing that he had limited options, Captain Sims decided that rather than rot away in a French port, he would go down with a fight. For a few days, the crew was trained and prepared for the ensuing fight. At the same time, Sims sought a diplomatic solution to his problem. Sims issued a challenge which he hoped would intimidate the Kearsarge and her crew.
My intention is to fight the Kearsarge as soon as I can make the necessary arrangements. I hope these will not detain me more than until tomorrow or the morrow morning at farthest. I beg she will not depart until I am ready to go out. I have the honor to be your obedient servant, Raphael Sims, Captain.
So yeah, it's the kind of old bluff of like, don't make me fight you.
Very, 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 very slowly, like peeling off his hockey gloves and just very gently sitting down his helmet.
I don't want to do this, but I will.
Ugh, don't make me come out there.
So on June 19th, Alabama left the safety of Cherbourg Harbor and met the Kearsarge in action. The ensuing battle was witnessed by French modernist painter Édouard Manet, who would actually go on to paint the Battle of the Kearsarge and the Alabama. Fairly famous depiction of that. And another account comes from a British yacht owner who actually brought his kids out to watch the battle. He had given them the option of watching the battle or going to church.
Most kids would probably choose the...
I mean, how do you not watch the ship battle, right?
Yeah.
Kearsarge recognized what was happening almost immediately and turned to meet the Alabama. Alabama would open fire first, with Kearsarge choosing to wait until her target was less than 1,000 yards away. I think you can already tell who's the confident one in this.
Well, and you can tell who probably has a more professional crew.
And keep in mind that although the Alabama crew has a ton of experience, it's in raiding. It's not in fighting necessarily. Like every time they fight, it's when they know they can win.
And especially in a sense like this, where with a lot of these vessels, as soon as Alabama shows that they're willing to open fire, a lot of those vessels are probably pulling up and just like letting, just like, here, do whatever.
Kearsarge is literally made to do this.
Yeah, and here you finally have like what you'd call a fair fight, and you get to see what can Alabama really do.
So the ships would dance around each other, moving in a generally southwestern direction, each making large circles trying to cross the T of the other.
One-on-one naval battles are always so interesting because of like imagining what that would look like if you were able to watch. Really boring for a lot of the time.
Truly like dogfighting. Everyone's just circling.
Yeah, it's just kind of like slowly trying to tighten the circle.
That's me every time I play World of Warships. I find myself just going in a circle. It quickly became evident that the tired Alabama was outclassed by the Kearsarge's gunnery. Alabama was dealing with faulty powder and fuses from some of their shells. They had just been out too long, and they haven't been able to resupply.
I was just going to throw in here, I don't know if it's mentioned, I was reading there's actually a lot of French language sources about this, as we'll see later, because it is a big part of like the history of Cherbourg and Normandy there. I was interested in, because I kind of knew the overall of like that she had come out of Cherbourg, and my question was like, why? Why would you do that? Because like it seems like you would just not want to do that. There was a limit to French hospitality because they were a neutral nation. Even though like Napoleon III, who's in charge at the point, he had considered entering France into the war, but there had been a statement issued, I think in February of 1864, laying out some of the ground rules for like what do we have to do as a neutral nation. And one of them was, I think foreign warships weren't allowed to be in a French port for longer than 24 hours, but there were some extenuating circumstances if they were making like necessary repairs. But there was a time limit basically, so they were basically forced out by these regulations. So that kind of answered my questions of why would they come out and try to have this fight.
And I feel like also like France can't be super stoked about having federal United States warships just parked right outside their harbor.
It is kind of funny though for France because like this one ship shows up and they're like, oh, okay, whatever, and then like the other side shows up. It's like, oh god, go outside and do this.
So at one point during this engagement, Alabama actually lands what would have been a critical blow to the enemy's stern post, but due to the faulty fuses, the shell did not detonate.
Oh, sucks to suck.
If this shell had landed, it's possible that the Kearsarge would have lost her steering or possibly gone down. She got lucky, but then got unlucky really quick from the Alabama point of view. It's noted that the Alabama had extremely poor fire discipline. This resulted in her firing too quickly and generally over her intended target. So, I mean, to me, that sounds like untrained crews. You're excited, so you're going as quick as you can, and you're not checking, you're not making sure that you're being effective. You're just putting rounds down range and saying that's good enough.
You're used to doing this against people where like the fear is enough. You know, as long as you put a shell somewhere in the vicinity, that's probably enough to get the job done.
So, unknown to Alabama, the Kearsarge had hull armor installed the year prior to the engagement. This was chain armor that was painted and hidden from plain view. Basically, the idea being this armored belt just absorbs all of the blows. Like, you can break the chains off, but that doesn't matter.
So surely, like, this was probably frustrating for the other side. It's like, I know I hit. That was a direct hit. I know I got him.
This is basically like a compromised ironclad.
I didn't realize that chain armor was a thing for ships.
Yeah, it was really interesting. I could go down that rabbit hole.
It reminds me a bit of the Red Wedding in Game of Thrones.
I still have not seen that.
When Catelyn Stark, well, you'll forget about this probably, but Catelyn Stark pulls up Roose Bolton's sleeve and she notices that he's wearing his chainmail at what's supposed to be a wedding. Something terrible is about to happen. Surprise chain armor.
So her armor belt line is actually struck twice during the fight, but it does hold. So she suffers no significant damage to her hull. In a little over an hour, the Alabama is clearly in trouble. Captain Sims strikes his colors as a symbol of surrender. Then he sends one of his two remaining longboats to the Kearsarge and asks for assistance. As Alabama is going down, Captain Sims tosses his saber into the ocean rather than surrender it to Commander Winslow of the Kearsarge.
I got some sore loser action going on here.
Kind of some petty petulance right there, but
it's all fun and games until someone can shoot back, isn't it?
It certainly seems that way.
Also, the time is funny because you mentioned in a little over an hour, Alabama's in trouble. For one of these naval fights, like, that's not a lot of time. Like, that's a short naval engagement relative to how these things normally go. So yeah, it is interesting to see like how little Alabama can do against a well-prepared and well-trained vessel.
In total, 19 of the 170 men aboard the Alabama were lost. 9 were killed in action, while 10 drowned. 21 were wounded, and Kearsarge is able to rescue about 110 of these men from the water. However, 41 men, including Captain Sims, are rescued by a private British craft owned by John Lancaster called the Deerhound. Interesting.
Just kind of hanging out.
Just happened to be there. This was actually observed by the Kearsarge as she worked to rescue others in the water. However, they couldn't do anything about it. These 41 men would be returned to England, and Sims eventually found his way back to the Confederacy, where he would be promoted to admiral right near the end of the war.
When there's probably nothing to do.
I can't imagine that in like 1865 there's much for a Confederate admiral to do.
When like the Confederacy like literally doesn't have any seaports.
No, like that's literally like Captain Crunch level of admiralty.
Captain Raphael Crunch. Does Captain Crunch have a first name?
He does now. One of the most noted acts of heroism during the sinking was by Dr. David Llewellyn from Britain. The doctor had been observed working throughout the engagement, helping the wounded and, making sure that the men that he could help were being helped. Then he observes an able-bodied sailor attempting to get into a lifeboat full of wounded men. The doctor said...
This guy's British, right?
Yes.
Oh, I was going to do Foghorn Leghorn, but that doesn't make any sense. See, I want to save my life as much as you do, but let the wounded men be saved first.
As the ship is going down, the doctor was observed on the ship and eventually is offered a spot on one of the lifeboats. However, the doctor shook his head and yelled,
I will not peril the wounded.
He's saying this like literally as the vessel's going down. His main concern is for the wounded on the lifeboats. And come to find out, the doctor was unable to swim. He had never learned. And he actually ended up going down with the vessel when he could have saved himself. So I don't know, hero or kind of silly. Like if there was enough room, could get in, but
all of this for the sake of the Confederacy.
Yeah. Moving on to the aftermath of, kind of the action here. One of the main outcomes of this event is what would become known as the Alabama claim. The United States sought damages from the United Kingdom in 1869 for attacks on merchant shipping by vessels built in the United Kingdom. Obviously, U.S. is not super stoked that Britain is basically building warships for the Confederacy.
Mm-hmm.
The primary focus was on Alabama, although there are other examples of this. In 1872, under international arbitration, the U.S. was awarded $15.5 million, and the dispute was considered settled. And this case helps establish legal precedent in international law, that some of which is still used today. And additionally, solving this issue, it allows for the U.S. and Britain to kind of move past their issues. Mm-hmm. This kind of results in a thawing of relations that we'll see, that continued on to today. It's the beginning of that.
Yeah, it's interesting. We've talked a little bit about the warming of relationships post like 1812, but like even by the Civil War, there's still that possibility that's discussed of like, well, if the Confederacy had proved its like viability, what would Britain have done? There was a possibility they could have entered, on the side or in opposition to the U.S.
And also like what happens when like the Confederates are like, you want New England, it's yours. You know what I mean? Or some variation thereof. You know what I mean? Of like, here you go. You can have some of what was yours back. The wreck of the Alabama was discovered by French divers in October 1984 in about 180 feet of water, 7 miles off the coast of Normandy. A research dive to the wreck site was conducted in November of 1987, and the U.S. would claim ownership of the wreck due to its long-standing position that the title to warships is not lost in the absence of capture or abandonment, and that abandonment could not be implied merely by the long passage of time.
That quote reminded me a bit of the Brother Jonathan. We discussed that, and we went in more detail in the bonus episode about that level of dispute with abandoned shipwrecks. Of one of the big factors is the passage of time without an attempt being made to recover or salvage, how that affects claims on a wreck site or the artifacts on a wreck site.
Yeah, that is a very interesting thing. And there's just, you could probably do a whole like legal class or case study on that, I'm sure.
One of the articles I read about that mentioned there was some level of dispute because at the time when it sank, it was considered the high seas. But I think the more recent definitions of what is a country's territorial waters, that now falls within France's territorial waters. So kind of something that has changed historically. It now is definitively, no one disputes that it sits in France's waters. But the issue just being, well, that's still ours.
I guess the other thing you'd have to say is it didn't belong to the U.S. It belonged to the Confederate States of America. But if the U.S. never recognized the Confederate States of America, does that mean the U.S. still owns it?
Or you could say because it was built in and by the British and it never officially belonged to the United States, does Britain own it?
So speaking of these disputes, France would claim ownership of the wreck due to its location in its territorial waters. Ultimately, the decision we made in favor of U.S. ownership, though with a good deal of collaboration in how to treat and preserve the wreck. The provisions adopted by the French government to establish a zone of protection around the wreck of the CSS Alabama shall remain in force for the term of this agreement unless the parties decide otherwise. The competent French authorities may amend these provisions as necessary. Neither party shall take measures adversely affecting the wreck or its associated artifacts without the agreement of the other party.
It's an interesting compromise that they come to of saying, well, it's definitely over there in your space, but it's ours. And so kind of compromising and saying, well, we'll have kind of joint custody of it.
Okay, United States, you can own it, but really, it's 50-50.
Also, I don't know. I didn't read too much about it. I don't know what's been done with the wreck, if any parts of it have been raised or artifacts or whatever, or in museums, or if it's still just there.
Yeah, I don't know. I have definitely probably had a little bit of an evolving opinion on like artifacts from wreck sites and stuff. Like, I feel like if it's picked up in the recovery or whatever, it's fair game to be preserved. But like, I don't know that I see a ton of value in diving on wreck sites and pulling stuff up. I can see the arguments for why it is important for museums and stuff, but at the end of the day, I don't know.
Some people draw the line at like, if something's within the wreck itself, maybe leave it there. But if it's kind of scattered about the wreck, easier to retrieve, you don't have to disturb the wreck site. Sure.
Yeah, I'm sure that, there's all kinds of justifications and different ways you could do it. But I don't know. I think the more I think about it, the more I'm okay with most of this stuff staying where it is.
Yeah.
As a general rule of thumb here. But yeah, that is the story of the Alabama. I think it's really interesting. It's just not something you hear about a whole lot in the American Civil War. I mean, a lot of it is like Gettysburg and Antietam, things like that, and all very important. But there is so much more going on than just guys standing in a row shooting at each other. These are the fun kind of stories we like to find. So yeah, with all of that said, I hope you guys enjoy this one, and we should be back next week with another.